Welcome to Signal Ahead. I'm Alfred. Today's briefing, Geopolitics SD Relevant, Tuesday, June 16. This is the synthesis above the noise, not the headlines, but the deep currents beneath them. Let's get into it. There's a phrase you'll hear knocking around the commentary at the moment, war and circuses, and it's meant as a wink, the old Roman recipe of bread and entertainment to keep the populace docile while the serious business of empire grinds on elsewhere. The clever observation is supposed to be that a leader can juggle an Iran crisis, a World Cup, and a cage fight all in the same week, that spectacle and statecraft now share a single calendar. But I want to suggest the genuinely non-obvious thing, the connection a casual reader scrolling the morning's headlines would slide right past, is the opposite of that. It isn't that the circus distracts from the war. It's that the circus and the war are now running on the same infrastructure, the same map, the same set of border crossings and stadiums and supply chains, and that this fusion is the actual state of the field. Consider what is happening across a single continent in a single week. A World Cup kicks off, the largest in history, 48 teams, the opening match in Mexico City, the tournament spread across 3 nations that share 2 of the most politically charged borders on Earth. At precisely the same moment, state and local agencies are conducting a surge in immigration arrests. A Coast Guard cutter is intercepting a small boat of migrants off Coronado, and a funding panel is quarreling over whether to run a wall through a national park. Now ask yourself, how do 80,000 people, and the players, and the broadcast crews, and the betting markets, and the tourist dollars cross those same borders that are simultaneously being militarized? The answer is that they cross on a 2-tier system. There is the lane for the desirable flow, fans, capital, athletes, spectacle, and the lane for the undesirable flow, and the entire apparatus of modern geopolitics is increasingly about engineering the difference between the two. That is not a distraction. That is the policy. You can see the same logic out on the water. We're told the Strait of Hormuz isn't closed anymore, but it isn't fully open either, and the workaround, the fascinating tell, is that one government is now borrowing another's shadow fleet tactics, the dark transponder, flag of convenience tricks pioneered to move sanctioned oil. So here is a great power adopting the evasion methods of its rival in order to keep commerce flowing through a contested choke point. The line between the legitimate economy and the grey economy has gone blurry deliberately as a matter of statecraft. Strait, border, stadium, turnstile, these are all the same kind of object now. They are valves. And the central question of our moment is who gets to decide which way each valve opens, and for whom. This is what I mean by the state of the field. The old grammar separated the hard from the soft. Hard power was missiles and oil and the Pentagon going briefly into lockdown. Soft power was football and arts festivals and a city naming a street after a beloved hometown athlete. That grammar has collapsed. Missile diplomacy, we are told, has fizzled. You're bombing what to get what exactly. Even as the same week brings a vow to seize an Iranian oil island and a quiet backpedaling toward a deal that the other side insists it hasn't actually agreed to. The strikes and the spectacle are not alternatives. They are instruments in the same orchestra, and the conductor is improvising. And here is the part that should unsettle us. While the grand chessboard absorbs all our attention, Hormuz, Karg Island, the Taiwan arms package, and a meeting that carefully avoided the word reunification. The consequential action is migrating downward and outward to the actors we don't usually file under geopolitics. A state fish and wildlife officer becomes an instrument of immigration enforcement. A governor releases long-delayed funds for a sewage crisis in a river valley that is, in every meaningful sense, a binational environmental wound. A journalist is murdered in Veracruz, the second this year, both in the same state, which tells you that in vast territories, the monopoly on violence has quietly changed hands. Meanwhile, a study finds that socioeconomic conditions are becoming biologically embedded in the brains of 9-year-olds. That, too, is geopolitics, if you take the long view, because it is the slow constitution of who a society will be. So the thesis I want to lay before you over the next while is this. We are living through the merger of the spectacular and the structural, a period in which the same borders, straits, and institutions serve simultaneously as theaters of entertainment and instruments of coercion, and in which the genuine decisions are increasingly made by sub-state actors operating below the altitude of the headlines. The casual reader sees a chaotic jumble: a golfer disgraced, a World Cup begun, a strike cancelled, an island threatened. I want to persuade you it isn't a jumble at all. It's a single system learning to run two errands at once, and once you see the valves, you cannot unsee them. Let's begin to trace where they laid. There's a particular kind of headline that arrives wearing a mask of decisiveness. The leader vows to seize an island. The strikes are imminent, then cancelled, then a deal is announced as coming soon, then the other side quietly notes that nothing has been agreed. Within a single news cycle, you can watch the same dispute presented as escalation, de-escalation, and triumph, often by the same voice. It would be easy to treat this as mere chaos, the weather of a particular temperament, but I want to suggest something less comforting and more structural. Beneath the noise of the threats and the reversals, there is a deep current, and the current is this: coercion is losing its purchase. The instruments that once produced obedience, the bomber, the ultimatum, the choke point, increasingly produce only motion. Things move around the obstacle rather than yielding to it. Consider the strait that everyone learns to worry about. For decades, the theory of that narrow waterway was simple: control the choke point, control the consequence. Close it and the world flinches. And yet the recent reality is stranger. The strait is not closed, but it is not fully open either. Ships still move, but they move by borrowing the very tactics that sanctioned states devised to survive being squeezed: the dim transponder, the relabeled cargo, the fleet that exists in a kind of legal fog. Here is the irony worth sitting with: a power that built an entire architecture of pressure to isolate its adversaries finds itself adopting the adversaries' evasions in order to keep oil flowing. The shadow fleet was supposed to be the disease. It has become the prescription. That is what a deep current looks like, when the tool of dominance and the tool of evasion converge, and you can no longer tell which side invented which. The same pattern shows itself in what one might charitably call missile diplomacy. The premise of that diplomacy is that force translates cleanly into terms that you bomb something in order to obtain something. But the sharpest observers, including those who once worked inside the machine, are reduced to asking a simple, devastating question: you're bombing what exactly to get what? When the strikes are launched and recalled, when the truce holds and frays and holds again in the same fortnight, the message ceases to be a message. It becomes static. Coercion depends on credibility, and credibility depends on the belief that the threat and the act are connected by a stable will. Strike, counterstrike, repeat. That is not a strategy, it is a metronome. And a metronome communicates only that time is passing. Now lift your eyes from the maps and look at the same current running through ordinary life, because that is where you confirm a structural trend is real rather than merely dramatic. Across a great tournament spanning a continent, 80,000 people fill a stadium, and the game proceeds magnificently indifferent to whichever ego imagines it presides over the spectacle. The recent history of that competition suggests something quietly subversive. The event triumphs over the man who would brand it. In a border town, hundreds gather on a convention center lawn in 90-degree heat to watch a match, and no decree organized that gathering. It is the deep current of human attention flowing toward something it loves, around whatever stands in the way. But the current cuts both ways, and honesty requires me to say so. The same evasiveness that lets oil slip past a blockade lets cruelty slip past accountability. When a wildlife officer stops a couple walking their dog and asks for papers, when a boat of 9 people is intercepted off a familiar coast, when journalists are shot in a state that has become a graveyard for them, these are not noise either. They are the current too, running darker. Power that can no longer reliably coerce nations turns inward and coerces individuals, because the individual cannot move around the obstacle the way a tanker can. The pessimism showing up in the polls, a nation approaching its 250th year and doubting its own future, that is people sensing the same thing the strategists sense. The old levers are being pulled, and the machine no longer answers. So what is the trend beneath the trend? It is the declining yield of force. Not its disappearance: force still kills, still detains, still terrifies, but its diminishing capacity to produce the outcome it intends. The strait stays half open, the deal stays half made, the tournament outlasts the showman. Water, oil, attention, migration, all of them root around the wall rather than honoring it. And the actors who still believe the wall is the answer find themselves, like that requisitioned shadow fleet, adopting the methods of the very people they meant to stop. Keep this current in mind, because in our final stretch I want to ask the harder question. If coercion yields less and less, what is quietly accumulating power in its place, and whether we are wise enough to recognize it before it, too, hardens into a wall. Now we arrive at the part where we try to make sense of it all, to ask what these scattered signals add up to, and what a careful observer ought to watch in the months ahead. Start with the largest pattern, which is the one easiest to miss precisely because it's so theatrical. We have at this moment a peculiar simultaneity, the threat of seizing an Iranian island and the spectacle of a 48-team football tournament unfolding across the same continent that hosts the seizing. There's an older phrase for this, bread and circuses, and it's worth resisting the lazy cynicism it invites. The point isn't that the games are a distraction from the strikes. The point is that statecraft increasingly operates in both registers at once, and that the boundary between the two has grown porous. A strait that is not closed but not fully open is a perfect emblem of the age. Nothing resolves. Everything stays in a managed ambiguity that benefits whoever has the patience to live inside it. Watch, then, for whether the coercive instruments actually purchase anything. The most damning question one can ask of any campaign of pressure is the one a former insider posed bluntly: you're bombing what to get what? When the answer becomes unclear even to the people doing the bombing, you are watching missile diplomacy fizzle in real time. The deal that is always about to be announced soon is itself a kind of tell. Here is the second-order implication, and it's the one I'd press hardest. Power that relies on continuous spectacle erodes its own credibility every time the spectacle fails to deliver. Naming a new intelligence director after a politically toxic pick collapsed, resuming normal operations after a lockdown, backpedaling on strikes while the other side insists no deal exists. Each individual episode is forgivable, even mundane. But accumulate them, and you get a texture of improvisation rather than strategy. And texture is what allies read. The leader of Taiwan's opposition emerges from a meeting noting carefully that the awkward word reunification went unsaid, even as the island waits on a $14 billion arms package and wonders, not unreasonably, about the durability of any commitment. That is the sound of a hedge being constructed. When the strong appear erratic, the dependent begin quietly building doors they can exit through. Watch the arms packages, watch the language partners use about each other, and watch above all for the gap between what is promised and what is delivered. The gap is the story. Now bring it home, because the genius of geography is that the global and the local are the same place wearing different clothes. The same border that sees a Coast Guard interception of a 24-foot boat off Coronado is the border across which a continent's worth of football fans gather on convention center lawns in 90-degree heat to cheer a shared team. The same region where millions are finally released to address a sewage crisis that has poisoned a river valley for years is the region where a wildlife officer in Florida stops a couple walking their dog to demand identification. These are not separate stories. They are the local weather of the same global front. The enforcement surge and the festival arrive together, and a population is asked to hold both in mind, to celebrate the shared and fear the foreign in the same breath. That contradiction is not sustainable indefinitely, and the polling already shows its residue, a citizenry growing more pessimistic about its own future as it prepares to mark 250 years. So what should you actually watch? 3 things. First, the environmental signal, because it ignores rhetoric entirely. A 63% chance of very strong El Niño conditions this winter is a hard fact that will arrive whether or not a deal is announced soon. Drought, flood, infrastructure under strain, these things sort the competent from the performative very quickly. Second, watch what becomes biologically embedded, to borrow a phrase from research on children's developing brains. When socioeconomic conditions start writing themselves into biology, you are no longer dealing with policy that can be reversed by the next administration. You are dealing with consequences that compound across a generation. The slow crises will outlast every fast one on the front page. And third, the quietest signal of all, watch who keeps showing up to do the dangerous work of telling the truth. A journalist murdered in Veracruz, the second this year in a single state. That is what it costs, in some places, simply to report what happened. It's a useful corrective to our fascination with spectacle. The substance of public life, the river cleaned, the testing capacity built in a place fighting Ebola, the record kept honest, is rarely televised and never goes viral. What it all means, then, is this. We live in an era that rewards the loud and quietly punishes the slow and serious. The discipline for any of us is to keep our attention on what compounds rather than what flashes. The circus will always be in town. The question is whether anyone is still minding the bread. Until next time, mind the signal, not the noise. That's the signal for today. The noise will keep coming. We'll keep finding what's underneath it. This has been Signal Ahead with Alfred. Until next time.